She was attacked in her sleep, in her own bed. No warning, no struggle, just sudden, overwhelming violence in the one place she should have been safe. And just rooms away, her children were inside that same home. This wasn't a break-in, no forced entry. No stranger in the dark. This came from inside her life. Her name was Lakeisha Malone, a 36-year-old mother, raising her children in a place meant to protect them. But on December 30th, 2025, that sense of safety collapsed in the worst possible way. Because the person accused of carrying out that attack wasn't unknown to her. It was someone connected to her life, someone tied to her family. And that's what makes this case so difficult to process. There were no widely reported warnings, no clear signs made public beforehand, no obvious build-up that anyone on the outside could point to and say, this was coming. Yet somehow, it still ended in extreme violence, inside a home, in the middle of the day, with children present. In this episode, we're going to break down exactly what happened inside that house, what investigators say they found when they arrived, the disturbing details of the attack itself, and the question that still doesn't have a clear answer. Why? Because sometimes the most unsettling cases aren't the ones filled with chaos. They're the ones that seem quiet, right up until the moment everything falls apart. Before we go deeper, tell me where you're watching from, and stay with this case, because the details only get more disturbing. Welcome to Dark Trace Crime Stories, where every case leaves a trail and every detail matters. If you're drawn to real-life crimes, untold truths, and the moments that changed everything, go ahead and subscribe, because here, we don't just tell stories. We follow the dark trace all the way to the end.
Accused of murdering a woman with a homemade club, this brutal attack happened yesterday in Evanston, and today the suspect made his first court appearance. Local 12's Christian Hauser was there.
At the center of this case is a woman whose life, by all available accounts, was grounded in something simple, but powerful: family. Lakeisha Malone was 36 years old. She was a mother, raising her children in Cincinnati's Evanston neighborhood, focused on building a stable and steady life. Her cousin, James Rice, shared a perspective that stands out. Not because it's dramatic, but because it's consistent with how victims like Lakeisha are often remembered by the people who knew them best. He described her as someone who wouldn't do anything bad to anybody. That's not just a passing comment. It speaks to her nature, someone who avoided conflict, someone who wasn't known for confrontation, someone who carried herself in a way that didn't invite chaos into her life. And that matters in a case like this. Because when people hear about violent crimes, there's often an unspoken question. Was there trouble before this? Was there a pattern? But in Lakeisha's case, nothing publicly documented suggests a life surrounded by constant turmoil. Instead, what we see is a woman centered around her role as a parent, raising her children, maintaining her household, and staying connected to her family. She had at least 2 children. One teenager, one younger. Her children weren't just part of her life, they were at the center of it. And on the day she lost her life, they were still there. Inside that same house. She was attacked in her sleep. Because now, this isn't only about a mother whose life was taken. It's about the children left behind, and what they may have been exposed to in those moments. Beyond her immediate household, Lakeisha's extended family played a visible role in the aftermath. Her cousin, James Rice, stepped forward, not only to speak about who she was, but to help carry the weight that followed her death. Everything about her life pointed toward quiet stability. To understand how this case reached such a violent outcome, you have to look at the one connection that ties everything together. Andre Michael Redmond, a 40-year-old man, identified as the father of at least one of Lakeisha Malone's children. That detail alone establishes more than just familiarity. It points to a shared history, a level of trust, a connection that goes beyond casual interaction. This wasn't someone passing through her life. This was someone tied to her family. At the time of the incident, both Lakeisha and Redmond were inside the same home on Hewitt Avenue. That fact is critical because it confirms proximity, not just on the day of the attack, but within the living environment itself. They were not separated by distance. They were under the same roof. What remains unclear, however, is the exact nature of their relationship leading up to that day. There are no widely reported records of prior domestic violence involving Redmond. No public history of arrests tied to violent behavior. No detailed account of repeated disturbances or escalating confrontations. Even during early court proceedings, the defense referenced the lack of a known violent background as part of their argument regarding bond. And yet, despite that, prosecutors pointed to the severity of what happened inside that home as evidence of how dangerous the situation had become. That contrast is difficult to ignore. On one side, a lack of documented warning signs. On the other, an act of extreme violence. The use of a homemade wooden object, described as a club, was not something typically found as a standard household item for defense or daily use. It raises the question of whether it was selected or prepared ahead of time. Then there is the setting of the attack itself. According to court statements, Lakeisha Malone was likely in bed at the time the assault began, possibly asleep. That detail changes everything about how the event is understood, because it suggests a lack of confrontation. No immediate argument. No visible escalation in that moment. Instead, it points to an act carried out when the victim was at her most vulnerable. On December 30th, 2025, police in Cincinnati's Evanston neighborhood were called to a home on Hewitt Avenue following what was initially described as a suspicious situation. It was the middle of the afternoon when officers arrived. Inside that home, they would find the scene that would define this entire case. At the center of it was Lakeisha Malone. She had suffered severe injuries. Injuries so critical that she was pronounced dead at the scene. But the sequence of what led to that moment begins before police ever entered the home. It begins inside the residence itself. Inside the bedroom. According to court records and investigative findings presented later, the attack took place inside the home where Lakeisha lived. More specifically, inside her bedroom. She was likely in bed at the time it began, possibly asleep, unaware of what was about to unfold. There was no public indication of a confrontation leading into the moment. No documented argument that escalated in that exact time frame. Just the sudden transition from a normal home environment into extreme violence. And the weapon used in the attack was not accidental. Authorities identified it as a homemade wooden club, a makeshift object described as resembling a bat or paddle-like implement. That detail matters, because it suggests this was not something randomly grabbed in the heat of the moment. It raises questions about preparation, about intent, about how and why that object came to exist in that setting. The injuries inflicted on Lakeisha Malone were described by investigators as severe blunt force trauma. So severe that one responding detective later characterized the scene as among the most violent he had encountered in his career. The condition of the room reflected the intensity of the attack. This was not a brief altercation, it was sustained, overwhelming, devastating in its outcome. And yet, what makes this case even more difficult to process is not only the violence itself, but what surrounded it. Because while this was unfolding, there were others inside the home. Children were inside the residence at the time of the attack. That single fact changes the emotional weight of everything that follows. This was not an isolated confrontation between two adults in private. This was violence occurring within a household where children were present. The full extent of what they saw or heard has not been publicly detailed. But their presence alone adds another layer of urgency and tragedy to the case. It means the aftermath of this event didn't begin at the moment of discovery by police. It began immediately inside that home. When officers arrived at the residence, they were responding to a report of a suspicious situation. What they encountered was far more severe than what had been expected. Inside, they located Lakeisha Malone suffering from critical injuries. Despite emergency response, she could not be saved. She was pronounced dead at the scene. At that point, the investigation shifted immediately from response to homicide inquiry. The home that was meant to be a place of safety became an active crime scene. And the focus turned quickly to identifying what had occurred inside those walls. While investigators began their work, the impact on those closest to Lakeisha was already unfolding. The fact that her children were present in the home during the attack ensures that this case extends beyond physical violence. It becomes a lifelong emotional event for those who were there. Family members were left to process not only the loss itself, but the circumstances surrounding it. A mother gone, a home changed in an instant. Children placed at the center of an event no child should ever experience. The shock moved outward quickly, from the scene itself, to relatives, to the wider community trying to understand how something like this could happen without warning. And as details began to emerge, one question began to dominate everything else. At this point, what do you think really happened inside that house? Do you believe this was planned, or something else? Let me know in the comments. As the immediate aftermath settled, investigators began piecing together the legal response that would follow. But for those inside that home, And for the family left behind, the reality of what happened had already been established. A life was taken. A household was shattered, and the circumstances raised questions that would carry far beyond that day. The investigation moved quickly after the discovery inside the Hewitt Avenue home. With the scene processed and initial statements collected, authorities focused on identifying the person responsible for what had taken place. That focus led directly to Andre Michael Redmond. He was taken into custody on the same day as the incident. There was no long search, no extended manhunt. The arrest came swiftly, signaling that investigators believed the evidence at the scene already pointed clearly toward him as the primary suspect. From that point forward, the case transitioned from emergency response to formal criminal proceedings. Redmond was initially charged with murder in connection to the death of Lakeisha Malone. Given the severity of the allegations, prosecutors moved quickly to ensure he remained in custody while the case developed. When Redmond appeared in court, he entered a not guilty plea. That moment is critical, because from that point forward, the case was no longer just about what investigators believed. It became a legal battle that would have to be proven in court. A follow-up hearing was scheduled for January 2026, marking the next phase in the process as both sides prepared to argue their positions. This is where the case officially transitions into something that could take months, or longer, to resolve. Bond was set at $2 million at the early stage of proceedings. This figure reflected the seriousness of the accusation, as well as the court's concern about the nature of the alleged offense. But the case did not remain static for long. As investigators continued reviewing evidence and refining their findings, the charges were expanded. A grand jury later returned a more detailed indictment, significantly increasing the scope of the allegations. The updated charges included 2 counts of murder, 2 counts of felonious assault, tampering with evidence. This expansion indicated that prosecutors believed the actions involved multiple layers of criminal conduct, not just a single charge tied to the fatal outcome. It also suggested that additional circumstances surrounding the incident were being considered in court. With the upgraded indictment came increased attention to how the legal system would handle the case moving forward. As the legal process unfolded, both prosecution and defense presented opposing arguments regarding Bond. The prosecution pushed for a significantly higher amount, arguing that the seriousness of the charges justified strict financial conditions to ensure public safety and court compliance. Their position was a proposed bond of $3 million. The defense, however, argued in the opposite direction, requesting a reduction to $500,000. Their argument focused on the lack of documented violent history and the absence of prior convictions in public records. After reviewing both positions, the court ultimately set Bond at $2 million. Later developments in the proceedings led to a further adjustment, increasing the bond to approximately $2.3 million. This shift reflected the ongoing reassessment of risk and case severity as more information was reviewed. As the case progressed into formal court proceedings, Redmond entered a plea of not guilty. This marked the beginning of what is expected to be a lengthy legal process, with both sides preparing for trial. As of now, the case remains unresolved, with trial proceedings still pending. No final judgment has been reached, and the court has yet to determine guilt or innocence. For the family of Lakeisha Malone, the legal process has brought little immediate relief. Their response has remained focused on accountability and justice. They have publicly called for the maximum possible sentencing, emphasizing the severity of the loss and the impact it has had on those left behind. Beyond the courtroom, the emotional aftermath continues to unfold. The family is still processing not only the death itself, but the circumstances surrounding it, and the fact that the case remains ongoing adds another layer of emotional strain. For them, every court update is not just a legal development. It is a reminder of what was taken from them on that December afternoon. And while the justice system continues its process, the central reality of the case remains unchanged. A mother is gone. A family is grieving, and the search for full accountability is still underway.
And there were children present in the home at the time of the attack.
Redmond's been charged with murder in the criminal complaint, and the court records outlining the case were filed on Tuesday. Redmond's criminal history in Hamilton County consists largely of traffic violations. He did plead guilty to a disorderly conduct charge from 2009 and had 2 gun charges from 2004 for furnishing a firearm to a minor and the improper handling of a firearm in a motor vehicle.
When you strip everything back, the charges, the courtroom proceedings, the headlines, you're left with the person at the center of it all. Lakeisha Malone. A mother. A daughter. A family anchor who, by all accounts, was focused on raising her children and maintaining stability in her home. Her life was not defined by chaos or public conflict. It was defined by presence, being there for her children, holding things together, and building a sense of normalcy inside her household. And that is what makes the outcome so difficult to accept. Because this wasn't something that happened in a dangerous public space or an unpredictable environment. It happened in the place where she should have been safest. The place where trust naturally exists. The place where a mother puts her guard down. Inside her own home. The facts of this case have been laid out in court filings and investigative reports. But even those details cannot fully capture the human weight behind what occurred on that December afternoon. A life was taken in a space that should have offered protection, that a family was left to carry the aftermath. And children were present in the environment where it all unfolded. That reality is what lingers beyond the legal language and procedural updates. This wasn't just a crime. It was a life taken in the very place she should have felt most protected. If you believe stories like Lakeisha's deserve to be told the right way, subscribe to Dark Trace Crime Stories, because some stories don't just end, they stay with us.